there's been a failure of journalism. I think standards have been allowed to drop. Um, Quite simply, the role of journalists, the role of the media is to tell the truth, it's to report, it's to connect the dots, it's to provide viewers, consumers of the media with a comprehensive understanding of what's happening. And they've failed to do that. They've diluted, they've laundered, they've sanitized, they've meticulously guided readers and viewers to conclusions that reflect an alternative reality and effectively upheld a fiction. So whereas something is, Israel is carrying out crimes on an epic on an industrial scale in Palestine, readers and viewers aren't guided to those conclusions. They're not being told the full story. They're given a very partial understanding and given facts or drip-fed information that isn't in sync with the truth. Language plays a huge part because it ultimately how you use it and how you describe is how people receive and understand the reality. So, like you mentioned, if you're using the word clash, that's very different to, for example, slaughter, or if somebody is killed, that's very different to somebody dying or is found dead, which broadcasters often use to describe, countless deliberate targeting of civilians, for example. The word like occupation that's deliberately left out, or if you're talking about forcible displacement, that has very different impacts, rather than when what is described as people just forced to flee or happen to leave. So it plays a huge part in shaping understanding, shaping people's perceptions about what's going on, and ultimately reduces what is something quite clear and unambiguous, which is the oppressor and the oppressed. It reduces it to something where it's like two irreconcilable narratives, kind of where it's complicated. It's two sides fighting each other. And as I said, there's words that get used frequently, like fighting, conflict, clash, or even, ground maneuvers instead of illegal invasions, explosion instead of, bombardment, airstrikes. The choices are deliberate and conscious and ultimately play a part in diluting the reality and softening people's understanding about what's happening. So one which I think stands out is the killing of Hind Rajab, um, the 5-year-old girl, Palestinian girl in Gaza, and the facts of that incident were very clear, and it was a girl who was waiting for paramedics, waiting for hospital services, waiting for medics in the back of a car, and a tank sprayed the car with more than 350 bullets. Now that is several violations of international law. It's clearly irrational. It's clearly inhumane, and it was just reduced to Hind Rajab found dead. Now, found dead could be anything. Found dead, you could be found dead after overdosing, after being hit by something, falling. That doesn't describe what happened, and that is, I think, an example which is testament and symptomatic of this problem where crimes on an epic proportion take place and they simply reduce the language, reduces them in their severity and in the scale, and reduces people's understanding about the seriousness. Um, and like I said, the way that it's described, the language that's used plays a huge part in how people understand, because suddenly that's people who interact with that at surface level won't really understand uh, just how graphic, just how grim, that's how brutal the act is. And that's effectively, you could say that's the job. That's what the media has aimed to do in terms of whitewashing and sanitizing these crimes. There's definitely a difference, which you notice from whether it's independent outlets, new media, in comparison to kind of the legacy mainstream broadcasters and press, which is just the language used, the how far they're willing to go. The front pages of the National in particular, for example, have been categorical. They've called a spade a spade. They've accurately conveyed the reality. They've not been afraid to hold back in criticism in exposing, for example, British complicity, and Declassified is the same. The stories that they've and the investigations that they've generated, whether it's on RAF spy flights, whether it's on the visits by Israeli officials, the questioning of those officials when they arrive. There's just a different level of journalism. There's a different standard. There is a sense of journalism still being alive and holding power to account. And that hasn't been the case, I don't think, across the other newsrooms. You sense it's almost like they're being held back when it comes to their coverage and criticism of Israel, which I don't think those constraints necessarily exist at independent and kind of the alternative media outlets. There's definitely a bias at play in terms of this impacts editors and kind of the pressure and constraints that their staff and their team are under. And naturally, the media ecosystem here is you have a kind of close relationship between media and politics. And so even the media that, so-called progressive media might be close to the Labour Party, for example, right-wing media might be close to the Conservative Party. And so it's not really about holding power to account because those become almost allies or almost colleagues. And so when there's, for example, spy flights, when there is ministers falling short of criticism or condemnations, when there are failures from these politicians, whereas the media should latch on to that, there's a bit of a difference in the coverage where, for example, progressive media might go more after the conservatives and vice versa, rather than just have a flat approach across them all. And this is where, as we said, in failures of the media, there shouldn't be any bias, there shouldn't be any allegiances. It should just be exposing power, holding power to account. And the mainstream media kind of you get a sense that there is a kind of they lean towards one side or the other, and that impacts their reporting and who they're willing to criticize, who they're willing to hold to account, who they're willing to expose. Strong tie that Britain has with Israel and the fact they're considered a staunch ally in the Middle East, I think it definitely impacts reporting because, as I said, there's a direct link now between media and government and media and politics. So, in recognizing that Israel is an ally, it then means, well, why would you then expose information? Why would you then offer coverage that might put that ally in a bad light? And I think that's definitely been the case. There's so much that hasn't been reported. There's so much that's been neglected, so much that's been overlooked. As I said, the spy flights, the extent of the relationship with Britain and Israel, the visits between two states, why that hasn't been put on hold, the kind of the lobby groups that exist here, and the pressure that's taking place from within. All the depths of this relationship has impacted the level of coverage that we've seen. And whereas there should be tough questions being asked of Britain's role and Britain's relationship to Israel. The fact that there is such a good relationship is filtering through to the media because the coverage isn't as categorical as it should be. And like I said, there's a bit of a reluctance. And what if you were to simply replace the two countries and it was Russia, who's seen as an adversary, then it would be very different. And that's, I think, the ultimate litmus test. If it can't be consistent across the board, then there's a failure somewhere along the line. Yeah, there's definitely been a difference where a noticeable difference in language and framing. And I would say it's quite easy to give one example, but I think the best example where you can really sense a difference is following on from the October 7 and the coverage of the beheaded babies. And because that was in unison from the Express to the Mirror, the Metro, the Times, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail. These are all newspapers who you'd argue are on different parts of the spectrum broadly. And yet they all ran with very categorical coverage, very emotive, unapologetic coverage of the beheaded babies, which, by the way, hasn't been corrected. Now, if you contrast that to what has been the case of what Israel's done since, which is to maim, to slaughter, to kill, to systematically flatten and annihilate Gaza, that level of the unison and also the real emotive coverage hasn't been the same. And so it makes you question how it can be that 40 beheaded babies, which ultimately didn't prove to be true, got much more forthright coverage than the countless Palestinians, countless Palestinian children, countless Palestinian babies that were killed that didn't get front page headline to that degree, front page and coverage to that degree. So that's, I think, the greatest example, or the most profound example of a clear difference of black and white, where who is the target impacts the level of the coverage. I think with some of my work and the editors I've worked with and the commissions I've had, it's almost been a bit of a revealing process in the sense I've worked with editors and been allowed to kind of express freely and to report freely and to investigate freely, if that makes sense, and use language that isn't necessarily visible within the mainstream media. So it tells you that there is, if independent outlets can use it, if editors are happy with journalists using particular language and being categorical in their coverage, then why isn't that the case? Why is that not replicated in other newsrooms with much more resources, with much more personnel, with greater access? So if Declassified being an example, their investigation, some of the way in which they've stopped ministers, for example, and got answers out of them using just a small team of a handful of people. And you look at that compared to major broadcasters who aren't able to generate the same coverage, who aren't, being committed to the same level of journalism. I think what it's revealed is that there is an inherent bias in terms of when it comes to exposing certain things, when it comes to centering Palestinians, when it comes to explaining or covering what Israel's doing, there is a reluctance, and inherently there's a systemic bias at play where they're willing to go that extra length when it comes to China, when it comes to Russia, when it comes to if Israel's a victim, but when Israel's a perpetrator, there's a real they're almost they feel like that's a no-go zone. It's a part where they can't really commit as categorically. And as I said, it's noticing the difference and the lack of constraint amongst independent outlets and having the freedom to criticize, to report, to express freely, I think it shows exactly what is missing within the major newsrooms. A a shift that's taking place within in terms of where people get their information, who their sources are, whether other outlets are and other organizations are shaping understandings as opposed to it being chiefly the mainstream media. And I think people, it's almost a double-edged sword in the sense, in the coverage of these mainstream broadcasters and the mainstream media, they almost open the eyes of the public because the public see things on Instagram, they see things on social media, they see in real time the footage coming in, and then they see how it's being reported, and then they think, oh, hold on a minute, without even being told that there's a bias, they're noticing that bias themselves, and therefore seeking alternative sources and other avenues of information. So I think there's definitely been a shift and a trust in the media was always low, or at least was getting lower throughout the years. And I think the last few years have only crystallized that and really accelerated it.